Hey everybody! This week I'm coming at you with another episode of Travel Thoughts. I'm super excited about this one. Today we're going to be talking about passport privilege. For some of you that aren't familiar with this term, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction, so don't worry. Recently, I was having a conversation with my dad. I was talking about this family that I know in Nicaragua. I was explaining the situation with some of the family members having an issue in coming to Canada to visit some of their relatives that have emigrated here. And my dad was really confused. He said to me, "What do you mean? They can't come in? Like, they need to have this long application process for a visa? Why would they be rejected?" He had all these questions, and it was apparent to me that maybe there is a lot of people that don't know what it's like or haven't really come into a situation where they've struggled to travel. Because for a lot of us, it's kind of easy for us to just book a flight and get out. The only exception to that is COVID. Now, because of these restrictions, us people that are more privileged are starting to get a taste for what it's like for other people in the world to travel, which I think is really interesting, which is why I decided to do this video now. Let's take an example to start. As a Canadian traveling to Nicaragua, even with our restrictions with COVID right now, it is still possible. So even that aside, but let's talk normally. Normally, we can show up from a flight or crossing the land border and we're allowed to stay there for 90 days. No problem. Now, as a Nicaraguan visiting Canada, one would have to apply for a visa ahead of time to enter. There is no tourist card they can just get on arrival. Now, the cost of the visa for them is around $100 Canadian from our Canadian government. There are also other administration fees associated with the application process while they're still at home. So it's not just $100 actually. And even then, they require several forms. Sometimes they'll even have them require to get their biometrics taken, so a fingerprint, which also requires them to go into an office in person and have all this taken and filled out. It can take a long time. I actually looked this up and I know from talking to people, the process can take around 6 months, sometimes more. And obviously that means a last minute trip to go visit your family or just for touring around is very, very difficult. It's impossible. You can't do it. So I wanted to start with an example because it's something that I have more experience with personally. And after having that discussion with my dad, I was like, I need to make this video. So here we are, passport privilege. It's the ability to travel freely to countries without having to do visa applications, without having to pay big fees. And this is all based on the passport that you possess. For most of us, it's where we were born. Now, I find it interesting that a lot of us first world inhabitants aren't really aware of this because we haven't had to deal with it. And like I said, now that COVID is an issue, that's just a taste of what we're getting. Because even still, for some of us, we are still able to travel even more than what other people who weren't as privileged were able to do before COVID. We're still more privileged, even in COVID circumstances, which is kind of hilariously sad. All this extensive planning, the fees, the forms, these are things that other people on the planet, they're used to. Now we're like, oh, tests and forms for health government stuff, like we're overwhelmed. You know, that aside, I want to take a look at both ends of the spectrum of privilege, just so that you can get a general idea. Let's look at the most privileged and let's look at the least privileged and see the difference. I checked this online. You can go to this website too. I'll leave a link in the bottom because it's kind of interesting to have a look. So right now, when I checked this before I made this video, the most powerful passport is the German passport. These passport holders are allowed entry into 101 countries for free, and they are allowed to 34 countries with a visa on arrival. They're only required to apply for a visa and pay for a visa prior to arrival for 63 countries. Now, I assume that a lot of these numbers are actually due to some COVID restrictions as well. So I think that 101 countries for free would probably be higher pre-COVID. I would have to look through each country to check, but maybe I'll do that another time. So now let's look at the least powerful. The least powerful passport at the moment is that of Iraq. They are allowed free entry into only 3 countries. Let's take that in for a second. Let's compare 101 to 3. What? It's insane. They're allowed a visa on arrival for 27 countries, and they have to get a visa and whatever fees associated prior to arrival for 168 countries. That number, that's essentially almost the entire world. So if you're from Iraq, you cannot go anywhere unless you plan and do a lot of work beforehand. Our privilege of having to just, jump on a plane and go is insane. For my Canadian friends, because I'm a Canadian, so I want to try and make this relevant to you, we are allowed right now free entry into 66 countries, visa upon arrival for 41, and require visas for 89 countries. We are not as elite as the Germans, my friends, but the world is still very much our oyster for now. So now that we've taken a moment to be very grateful for this kind of mobility that we have to explore the planet, I want to talk about very briefly our responsibility for having that privilege. While I was in Nepal, I was staying in a very small village for part of my stay there, volunteering, and I made a friend there, and he was doing some research, science-related stuff in another town nearby. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because we had a discussion, and he mentioned this important responsibility as a traveler, and I think it's very important for this discussion about passport privilege. If you want to read a bit about him and his thoughts on this, check out my website. I'm going to put a link to the description below. I used to do interviews with people. I used to discuss about success and happiness and what it means to the individual. I might still do it in the future. So I'll leave the link to his story in case you're interested in reading what he said exactly. But I'm going to give you a quick quote. He said, "If we have the means to travel, we should understand and be aware of the differences in this world and try to make a change." So what does that mean? One, be aware. That's the least you can do. When you're traveling, if you have the privilege of being able to go wherever you like, that means traveling and observing, learning, not damaging or disrespecting. Cool. Right? Just be aware. When you're going around, if you have that privilege, be aware. So recognize your privilege and travel with respect for the land and its people. That is the bare minimum you can do. Now, number two, he mentioned making a change. I know maybe it sounds a little bit crazy, how can I make a change if I'm just, going to Mexico for a week? I get it. Maybe that's hard. Maybe we aren't all equipped and ready to maybe donate massive amounts of money or start any interesting nonprofits and whatever, but there are actually still some small ways that you can pitch in and help locals that don't take a lot of time and not necessarily that much money. First thing is buying and eating local. So staying at local guest houses as opposed to big chains, eating at local places where you see local people eating and the locals are cooking. Those are all good choices. That shouldn't be so hard. Right? Next thing, purchasing handmade souvenirs from local vendors rather than big shops. So you want to find the things that are totally made by the people that are supporting them as direct as possible. That's ideal. This is something you should try and do back home too. That's been a big trend as of late, buy local and everything. I think that's super important regardless. The last thing that you can do to try and make your change while abroad is booking locally run tours. Instead of finding some bigger tour online that you see ahead of time before you go, if you have time to make this possible, try and book them when you arrive with a local organizer instead, because the bigger companies that have a large online presence, a lot of them are run by people that are not from there. Do your best to find those tours that are run by local people. So those three things: buy and eat local, stay local, purchase handmade things by local vendors, and buying locally with the tours as well. And that actually will make a big difference. To summarize what I've talked about in this video really briefly, first things first, passport privilege exists. It's a thing. Even with COVID, we still have some pretty privileged people out there. Those of us who are privileged, even my Canadian friends out there, you should be grateful for the opportunities that we have. We should be aware, and if we choose to travel, understand that and be respectful as we can. If we choose to travel, we should do so as responsibly as we can and contribute in whatever ways that are available to us, no matter how menial they may seem. That's it for today's episode of Travel Thoughts. I hope you really enjoyed this topic. If you think it's interesting, if you have some random questions about it, feel free to drop me a comment. If you want me to dive deeper into this topic, please let me know. I'd love to talk about this more or maybe compare different places and destinations. It could be interesting, so let me know. Otherwise, please subscribe too if you're interested in this. I'm also going to be coming out with some travel tips as we go along and some more episodes like this, so stay tuned everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an awesome week. See you next time.